My fingers, more accustomed to the silky glide of a new bolt of fabric or the comforting roughness of worn cotton, knew when something was truly off. It wasn't a visible tear in the heirloom quilt, the one passed down through my mother's line, holding stories in every painstakingly stitched seam. No, it was a subtle shift, a whisper of a different thread, a synthetic fiber woven in where only natural linen had ever belonged. A foreign body, hidden deep within the pattern, pretending to be part of our history. Only someone who knew every stitch, every faded color and lovingly placed applique would have felt it. And I felt it. The betrayal wasn't screamed, it was subtly, meticulously inserted into the very core of what we called our legacy. But what could one old woman, armed with nothing but a thimble and a sharp eye, do against a deception so cleverly sewn? The hum of my sewing machine was the steady heartbeat of my quiet home. It was a sound I knew better than my own name, a rhythm that had stitched together the fabric of my days for longer than I cared to count. Here, among the bolts of calico and stacks of meticulously folded patterns, I found a piece that the outside world rarely offered. My small cottage, nestled at the end of a winding lane, felt like a sanctuary. Every piece of furniture, every framed photograph, held a whisper of a memory, a testament to a life lived fully, if not always loudly. The air often smelled faintly of lavender from the sachets I tucked into linen drawers, mingled with the earthy scent of new fabric and the warm, comforting tang of lint. This was my domain, a place where order and beauty were created from chaos, one careful stitch at a time. Most people, I suppose, would have called my life small. Unremarkable, even. They saw an old woman, hands calloused from needle and thread, tucked away in a house that smelled faintly of lavender and lint. They saw the matriarch of a family that had, in their eyes, long since moved beyond her, like birds leaving a nest to fly to grander horizons. My nephew, Arthur, for instance, with his sharp suits and even sharper pronouncements, often spoke of modernization and efficiency whenever he deigned to visit. He and his wife, Penelope, always seemed to carry an air of polite impatience, as if my very existence was a quaint, slightly inconvenient relic. I never complained. A quiet life had its own profound satisfactions, its own intricate beauty, much like a complex quilt pattern revealing itself stitch by slow stitch. I had learned, over the years, that the most important truths weren't always shouted from the rooftops, nor were they always found in the grand pronouncements of the successful generation. Sometimes they were hidden in plain sight, woven into the very threads of what you thought you knew, waiting for a patient eye to discern them. My quilting circle, a small gathering of ladies with equally nimble fingers and sharp wits, was the closest I came to a social whirl. Every Tuesday, our needles would fly, keeping pace with conversations that meandered like the patterns on our latest projects. Beatrice, bless her practical heart, always brought the best shortbread and the keenest observations, her spectacles perched on her nose as she scrutinized every seam. It was in these quiet moments, surrounded by the familiar comfort of fabric and friendship, that a mind like mine, often underestimated and given too much space to simply be, could truly begin to see things others might overlook. We were putting the finishing touches on the legacy quilt. That particular Tuesday, a piece destined for Arthur's new office, a rather grand gesture, I thought, considering his often dismissive attitude towards tradition. As I smoothed a patch of rich burgundy fabric, a replica of an old family crest, my gaze drifted to a stack of papers tucked away on a shelf near my work table. They were old property deeds, some yellowed letters, and a few ledgers from my late husband John's affairs. Arthur had mentioned needing them a few months prior, claiming he needed to modernize the records for the family trust. I had put them aside, telling him I'd get to them, not quite ready to part with the tangible echoes of John's presence. A peculiar feeling, like a knot forming in a thread where none should be, settled in my chest as I looked at the faded ink on one particular document, an old, seemingly insignificant land lease. It was nothing specific, just a vague unease, a sense that some of those papers, perhaps the ones I hadn't properly examined yet, contained more than just faded memories. I brushed it off then, attributing it to an old woman's sentimental fussiness, but the sensation lingered. A silent prickle beneath my skin, a tiny snag in the otherwise smooth fabric of my contentment. The peculiar feeling that had settled in my chest the other day, like a knot in a thread, refused to unravel. It clung to me even as the familiar hum of my sewing machine tried to lull me back into routine. The legacy quilt, for Arthur's new office, with its grand burgundy crest, now felt less like a gift and more like a symbol of something I couldn't quite name, but that felt fundamentally wrong. After the ladies left that Tuesday, leaving behind the comforting scent of shortbread and fabric dust, I found myself drawn back to the shelf. The stack of papers from John's affairs waited, silent and unassuming. I picked up the old land lease again, the one that had given me that vague unease. It was a lease for a small parcel of land that bordered the old family orchard, a piece John had always treasured. My fingers, accustomed to feeling the slightest imperfection in fabric, traced the faded cursive. It was John's signature, no doubt, but something about the date felt off, like a mismatched button on a finely tailored garment. Arthur had mentioned modernizing things, but what did that mean for papers like these? My husband, John, was a man of meticulous records, every I dotted, every T crossed. He'd taught me that a good seamstress checks every measurement twice, and a good steward checks every detail thrice. I found myself pulling out a few other documents from the stack, an older deed to that same orchard property, signed years before, and a letter John had written to his solicitor around the time of the lease in question. My eyes scanned the old deed first, noting the precise legal language. Then, I turned back to the lease. The date wasn't just slightly off, it predated a crucial change in local zoning laws, a change John had fought hard for, a change that significantly increased the land's value and possibilities. Yet, this lease, ostensibly signed by him, seemed to lock it into old, less favorable terms, essentially devaluing a portion of our family's most cherished asset. It was like finding a carefully mended patch on a quilt, only to realize the thread used was cheap, synthetic, and designed to tear. A cold understanding began to spread through me, chilling the warmth of the lavender-scented air. My gaze flickered to the names of the witnesses on the lease. One name in particular, a Mr. Thomas Finch, was utterly unfamiliar. John had always used local, trusted figures, people from the community. A small, unfamiliar name, tucked into a list of legal jargon, felt like a loose thread waiting to be tugged. This wasn't just about modernization. This was a carefully orchestrated maneuver, a quiet shifting of the lines, designed to go unnoticed by someone like me, who was supposed to be preoccupied with my patterns and pins. The betrayal wasn't a sudden explosion, it was a slow, deliberate snip in the fabric of our family's legacy, done with precision and a chilling lack of conscience. The cold understanding of the betrayal was like a sudden gust of wind through my open window, chilling me to the bone even indoors. It wasn't just the discovery of a faulty seam in our family's legal tapestry, it was the realization of the careful hand behind the needle, the deliberate choice to weave in deceit. My hands, still holding the offending land lease and John's meticulous notes, trembled slightly. This wasn't a mistake. This was a statement, a quiet declaration that I, Eleanor, was too old, too insignificant, too preoccupied with patterns and pins to notice the careful dismantling of our shared history. The sting of that dismissal was worse than any public insult. It was the ache of being invisible, of having my intelligence, my connection to John, and my stewardship of his legacy, utterly disregarded. For years, I had accepted the polite smiles and condescending pats on the hand from Arthur and Penelope, believing it was simply the way the world worked now. They were the movers and shakers, the ones who understood modernization, and I was simply the matriarch, kept in her quiet cottage, respected for a past they were actively erasing. It felt like a lifetime of small cuts, each one minor on its own, but together, leaving a wound far deeper than any physical injury. I walked to the window, watching the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across my garden. The petunias, in their vibrant purple and pink, paid no mind to the quiet turmoil raging inside me. John had planted those first petunias, his sturdy hands surprisingly gentle with the fragile seedlings. He had always seen me, truly seen me, beyond the housewife and the quilter. He valued my observations, respected my quiet strength. This betrayal was not just against our legacy, but against the memory of his trust in me. A fresh wave of resolve washed over me, a hardening within that felt both unfamiliar and deeply right. I wouldn't yell. I wouldn't confront. That wasn't my way, and it certainly wasn't the strategic path. Confrontation was for those who wished to make noise, I intended to make change. This wound to my spirit wouldn't fester. I would mend it, not with quick, visible stitches that merely covered the damage, but with the painstaking, invisible kind that reinforced the entire structure from within. My eyes fell upon my legacy quilt, still draped over the frame, its burgundy crest now a stark reminder of Arthur's supposed claim to our heritage. I thought of the Mr. Thomas Finch, the unfamiliar name on the lease. He was another loose thread, a single, unassuming fiber that, if pulled carefully, could unravel the entire deceptive pattern. The feeling of being dismissed, of being underestimated, began to transform from a silent ache into a quiet, simmering fuel. They thought me a sentimental old woman. Good, let them think it. It would be their undoing. The process of mending, I knew, began with understanding the flaw, no matter how painful that discovery might be. The sting of betrayal, once a raw wound, had begun to calcify into something harder, more useful. It wasn't forgiveness I sought, nor the catharsis of an angry outburst. Those were for softer souls, or perhaps, for those who hadn't spent a lifetime perfecting the art of the invisible stitch. No, what settled in my bones was a quiet resolve, a blueprint forming in the quiet corners of my mind, much like the intricate patterns I'd drafted for quilts, each line a calculated step towards a complete design. My old kitchen table, usually reserved for afternoon tea and quilting plans, became a silent war room. The papers, John's legacy of meticulously kept records, were spread out before me. Property deeds, bank statements, his correspondence with lawyers and land agents, a lifetime of careful stewardship laid bare. Arthur, in his calls for modernization, had unwittingly handed me the very tools I needed to expose his own clumsy restitching of our family's truth. He had underestimated my connection to these papers, my intimate knowledge of John's way of thinking, a way that honored every detail, every nuance. I didn't rush. Haste was the enemy of true precision. I organized John's documents not by date, as he had, but by subject, creating new categories in my mind: orchard land, family trust, investments. It was a slow, methodical process, requiring the same patience I applied to squaring up fabric before making a critical cut. Each document was held, examined, its feel and texture as important as its content. I looked for patterns, for inconsistencies, for any deviation from John's rigorous standards. The names, the dates, the amounts, every thread in this tapestry of family business was scrutinized. This wasn't about revenge, not in the fiery, immediate sense. It was about balance, about setting right a ledger that had been deliberately thrown askew. My peace, I realized, wouldn't come from their apology, but from my own liberation, from entangling myself from their deceitful weave. The idea of confrontation still felt distasteful, like using coarse burlap instead of fine silk. No, my method would be subtler, more akin to unpicking a single, central stitch that, when removed, causes the entire false pattern to fall away, revealing the true design beneath. My focus narrowed to the specific details surrounding the orchard land lease and that unfamiliar name, Mr. Thomas Finch. John's meticulousness meant there should be some record of this man, some prior interaction, a reference from a trusted source. His address books, old diaries, even the margins of his favorite gardening journals, nothing was too small to escape my renewed attention. It was here, in the overlooked details, that the most telling clues often hid. I began a new ritual. After my morning tea, before my sewing machine even hummed to life, I would spend an hour with John's old appointment books, cross-referencing names and dates against the suspect documents. I felt a quiet certainty that the thread Arthur thought he'd hidden so well would eventually lead me to the very heart of his careless pattern. My new ritual of delving into John's old appointment books had, at first, felt like sifting through sand for a single pearl. But patience, as any quilter knows, is a virtue that yields the finest results. Day after day, I traced names, dates, and casual notations, searching for any flicker of Mr. Thomas Finch. John kept an impeccable record of every meeting, every contact, even those purely social. Yet, Finch's name was conspicuously absent. It was as if he materialized solely for that one damning signature on the orchard land lease. Then, one crisp morning, nestled between an entry for a dental appointment and a note about ordering new rose bushes, I found it. Not Mr. Thomas Finch, but T. Finch, estate planner, A&P Ref. The date was a few months prior to the suspicious lease's signing. A&P Ref. Arthur and Penelope's reference. A cold dread, far more specific than the vague unease I'd felt before, crept up my spine. John had not engaged an estate planner named Finch. Arthur and Penelope had. And the timing, I pulled out the rest of the papers I had categorized under orchard land and family trust. The new zoning laws had indeed been enacted, increasing the value of the orchard significantly. John's plans, clearly laid out in letters to his solicitor, detailed how this would benefit the entire family trust, including, implicitly, my own future security. But the lease, signed just after the zoning change, locked a prime portion of that land into a long-term, low-value agreement. The beneficiary of that lease was a shell corporation, one whose name I now recognized from other documents, a company Arthur and Penelope had quietly formed the previous year for diversified investments. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening thud. They hadn't just devalued the land. They had siphoned off its potential growth, rerouted its future profits directly into their own pockets, using a newly established corporate entity and a seemingly legitimate, but fraudulent, lease. Mr. Thomas Finch, I now understood, was likely their man, a convenient, untraceable signature for their scheme. It was like discovering a hidden pocket in a beloved coat, only to find it filled with stolen trinkets rather than precious keepsakes. The entire deception was a carefully constructed web, stretching back months, even years, disguised as modernization, but in truth, a calculated act of self-enrichment at the family's expense, and crucially, at mine. The legacy quilt, meant for Arthur's office, suddenly felt like a shroud, woven not with family pride, but with avarice. With the full, intricate pattern of their deceit finally laid bare before me, the blueprint in my mind gained sharper lines. Knowing the truth was one thing, proving it, without raising alarms or allowing their preemptive strikes, was another entirely. This wasn't a project for my quilting circle, nor a matter for public outrage. This required the finesse of a surgeon's hand, precise and utterly discreet. My first step was to secure what I now considered my evidence kit. The suspicious land lease, John's corresponding deeds and letters, the telling entry in his appointment book referencing T. Finch, A&P Ref. These were the threads I needed to carefully gather. I stored them in a strongbox John had once used for his fishing lures, a place I knew Arthur and Penelope would never think to look. The old wooden box, smelling faintly of metal and dried earth, became my silent accomplice. But John's papers, however meticulous, were only one side of the story. I needed external verification, a third-party confirmation that could stand on its own. Arthur and Penelope had operated under the guise of modernization, implying they were acting in the family's best interest. I needed to find a way to gently tug at that facade without them feeling the pull. My thoughts turned to Mr. Davies. He was the family's trusted solicitor for generations, a man whose reputation was as unblemished as a fresh bolt of white linen. He oversaw the general family trust, a separate entity from John's personal affairs, but often intertwined through various assets. Approaching him directly with accusations would be akin to throwing a handful of pins onto a polished floor, messy, loud, and sure to cause a scene. My method had to be more subtle, a quiet inquiry under the guise of an old woman seeking clarity. I telephoned Mr. Davies' office, my voice as calm as a summer lake. I explained that I was finally getting around to tidying up John's older papers and had come across a few documents relating to the orchard land that I found a little confusing. Would he, in his professional capacity, be able to shed some light on the general history of the land transactions, perhaps regarding any zoning changes or long-standing leases? I mentioned, as an afterthought, that a name, Mr. Thomas Finch, had appeared on an older lease, and I wondered if he was a familiar figure in local legal circles. It was a delicate dance, like easing a needle through fine silk without leaving a mark. Mr. Davies, ever the professional, agreed to a brief consultation. He was accustomed to dealing with the minutiae of long-standing family affairs. He mentioned that Arthur had indeed been quite keen on reviewing various trust documents recently, even asking about some specific properties, including the orchard, a few months back. Wanted to make sure everything was in order for future planning, you understand, Mr. Davies had said, his tone entirely benign. But to my ears, it was another subtle confirmation, another thread connecting Arthur's eagerness to John's missing papers and the deceitful lease. Mr. Davies, in his diligent, unwitting way, had just provided the first official, outside corroboration I needed. The evidence, it seemed, was beginning to weave itself. My meeting with Mr. Davies had been a success, a single, precise stitch in the larger design. He remained blissfully unaware of the true gravity of my confusions, but his polite corroboration of Arthur's recent inquiries had validated my suspicions. The next step wasn't about more investigation, it was about laying a subtle trap, a loose thread in their carefully constructed facade that they would be compelled to tug themselves. Arthur and Penelope, despite their disdain for my traditional ways, were sticklers for appearances. Their social standing was a finely polished veneer they guarded with fierce dedication. I knew they were planning a grand family dinner, a celebration of Arthur's latest career advancement, a perfect stage for my quiet unraveling to begin. I waited until the week before the dinner, then placed a call to Arthur. My voice was gentle, almost frail. "Arthur, dear," I began, "I'm still sorting through some of your Uncle John's old papers. I found a rather peculiar land lease regarding the orchard. The dates seemed a bit muddled. I spoke with Mr. Davies just to clarify some details, and he was most helpful. He mentioned you'd been looking into the orchard, too. Such a coincidence." I paused, letting the silence hang, a fragile piece of silk stretched taut. "He also mentioned a Mr. Thomas Finch. Do you know him?" There was a noticeable pause on the other end, a momentary flicker of hesitation that I could almost see, even over the phone. It was the sound of a carefully placed brick shifting in their wall. Arthur's voice, when it returned, was a fraction too smooth, a shade too hearty. "Ah, yes, Aunt Eleanor, old John could be a bit disorganized, bless his heart. Just some old family business, nothing for you to trouble your head about." "And Finch? Oh, yes, he's a rather obscure old contact of mine, helped with a few minor things years ago. Nothing relevant, truly." He chuckled, a sound that grated like a dull needle. "Don't you worry your pretty head. We'll chat more at dinner, won't we?" His quick dismissal, the hurried reassurance, and the vague lie about old family business, and minor things, were exactly what I expected. The mention of Mr. Davies and the direct inquiry about Finch had clearly unsettled him. I had cast my line, and I felt a faint, telltale nibble. They would assume I was merely confused, an old woman stumbling upon documents she didn't understand, but the seed of doubt was planted, a tiny burr beneath their impeccably tailored skin. They would, I was certain, spend the next few days wondering just how much that old woman really knew, and what else Mr. Davies might have inadvertently shared. It was a snip in their fabric, tiny but strategic, designed to make them check their own seams. The grand family dinner, Arthur's celebratory ascent, was a carefully orchestrated affair. Penelope had outdone herself, every detail polished to a blinding gleam, crystal shimmering, silver gleaming, and a guest list packed with the kind of influential faces that spoke volumes of their carefully constructed world. Arthur, resplendent in a tailored suit, moved through the room with an almost regal air, accepting congratulations with practiced humility. They looked like the perfect picture of success, a seamless, opulent tapestry. And I, in my simple gray silk, watched from a quiet corner, a discerning eye ready to spot the first pulled stitch. The call I'd made to Arthur had done its work. I saw it in the way Penelope's smile tightened when she greeted me, a fraction too bright, a touch too forced. Arthur, usually so outwardly dismissive, lingered a moment longer than necessary, his gaze flickering over me as if searching for a hidden weapon. They had spent the week, just as I predicted, trying to ascertain how much I knew, and their unease was a live wire humming just beneath the polished surface of their gathering. During dinner, the conversation flowed around me, mostly effusive praise for Arthur's shrewd business dealings. Penelope, sitting opposite him, would interject with anecdotes designed to bolster his image, each one a thread woven tighter into their narrative of success. I ate my perfectly roasted duck, listening, observing. I caught Arthur's eye once, and instead of my usual placid nod, I offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. It was a private signal, a silent acknowledgement that I saw them. Then, Arthur, fueled by too much expensive wine and the glow of adulation, launched into a grandiose speech about the family's future, about smart investments, and maximizing assets, all designed to honor the legacy John built. He gestured vaguely, his hand sweeping across the room. We're ensuring our heritage thrives, not just for us, but for generations, he boomed, his gaze briefly, nervously, landing on me. It was my cue. I dabbed my lips with my napkin. Yes, Arthur, I said, my voice gentle, carrying just enough to reach the nearest ears at our table. I was just thinking about that. It's so clever, the way you've managed to re-evaluate certain older assets. Like the orchard land, for instance. John always thought so highly of its potential, especially after those zoning changes. I paused, then added, as if an innocent afterthought, and to think, all those years, we might have had it tied up in that peculiar old lease with. What was his name? Oh, yes, Mr. Thomas Finch. So glad you looked into that, dear. The effect was instantaneous and far more satisfying than any shout. Penelope choked on her wine, dabbing furiously at her mouth. Arthur's face, which had been radiating self-satisfaction moments before, blanched. His eyes darted around the table, a panicked bird trapped in a cage. Aunt Eleanor, he stammered, his voice losing its booming confidence, we discussed this. Just old family business. Nothing for concern. He tried to laugh, but it came out as a strained cough. The polite murmurs at our table ceased. Heads turned. The seamless tapestry had snagged, right in the center, and now everyone was looking at the pulled thread. The air, once light with celebration, thickened with a sudden, palpable discomfort. Their polished facade, I realized, was already beginning to fray. The family dinner had ended in a flurry of hushed goodbyes and nervous glances. Arthur and Penelope, their carefully constructed facade ripped at the seams, had practically fled, leaving their perfectly roasted duck untouched. I, on the other hand, had finished my meal with quiet satisfaction. The snip had been made, now the unraveling would begin in earnest. I had set the stage, not for a grand confrontation from me, but for their own panicked reactions to expose the full, ugly truth. Within 2 days, Arthur's phone calls began. He started politely, suggesting we meet to clear up any misunderstandings. But his tone grew increasingly strained, laced with an edge of desperation. He tried to brush off my comments as confusion due to age, painting me as a senile old woman, just as I knew he would. That, however, was a thread I was more than happy for him to pull. The more he dismissed me, the more he confirmed his own guilt. I feigned a sudden interest in modernizing my own small investments, using the opportunity to call Mr. Davies again. I explained, with a sigh that hinted at a sweet but bewildered old age, that Arthur seemed quite agitated by my questions about the orchard. He keeps insisting everything is fine, dear, I said, but my old brain just can't seem to shake this Mr. Thomas Finch. You know, the one he said was a minor contact years ago? But his name is on that recent lease for the orchard land, and John's appointment book suggests Arthur and Penelope introduced him around the time of the zoning changes. My, isn't that a peculiar coincidence, Mr. Davies, God bless his by-the-book nature, was a man who lived for order. The notion of a peculiar coincidence, in legal matters, especially concerning a family trust he oversaw, would have pricked his professional conscience like a misplaced pin. He listened, his silence on the other end a far more effective response than any blustering from Arthur. Mrs. Eleanor, he finally said, his voice grave, I assure you, I will look into this personally. This is quite unusual. The knot I had so carefully planted in his mind was tightening. The following week, the atmosphere in my quaint little world shifted dramatically. It began with an urgent call from Mr. Davies, requesting a formal meeting. He arrived at my cottage, not with his usual cheerful demeanor, but with a somber set to his jaw. He carried a heavy briefcase, not a single stitch out of place. He confirmed what I already knew. Mr. Thomas Finch was not a legitimate, independent estate planner. He was a disbarred attorney, working under a new, untraceable firm created by Arthur and Penelope. The shell corporation was indeed theirs. The lease was a fraudulent document, expertly crafted to appear legitimate but designed to funnel the orchard's heightened value directly into their diversified investments, their own private coffers. It's a complete fabrication, Mrs. Eleanor, Mr. Davies concluded, his voice barely a whisper. A meticulously planned fraud against the family trust, and against your late husband's intentions. Arthur and Penelope, They've systematically stripped value from the trust, diverting assets for years, beginning with that orchard transaction. The world seemed to spin for a moment, not from shock, but from the sheer weight of vindication. It was exactly as I had seen, stitch by invisible stitch. But the confirmation, spoken aloud by a respected professional, carried a force I couldn't ignore. This wasn't just about my quiet suffering anymore. This was a clear, undeniable breach of trust, a direct assault on John's legacy, and a theft from the very fabric of our family. The true deception, the carefully woven tapestry of their greed, had finally, undeniably, been pulled apart for all to see. The truth, once spoken aloud by Mr. Davies, hung in the quiet air of my cottage, heavy and unyielding. It was not a surprise, not a sudden revelation, but the solid confirmation of a pattern I had already discerned, thread by careful thread. The weight of it, however, was immense, like a perfectly balanced stack of quilts, each one pressing down with its own story of deception. My initial vindication now mingled with a sense of weariness, but it was a weariness born of accomplishment, not despair. The time for quiet observation and subtle maneuvering was over. It was time for the final cut. What are our options, Mr. Davies? I asked, my voice calm, belying the storm that had raged within me for months. My goal was not to rebuild bridges or to seek reconciliation with those who had so thoroughly betrayed the very meaning of family. My goal was liberation, to sever myself from their deceitful weave and protect what little remained of John's true legacy. Mr. Davies, ever the professional, laid out the legal pathways. There were grounds for a substantial lawsuit, to recover the diverted assets and dismantle the fraudulent structures Arthur and Penelope had erected. There would be public exposure, no doubt, and a significant blow to their carefully cultivated reputations. He spoke of injunctions, of forensic accounting, of the meticulous work required to untangle the layers of their greed. He had already contacted the necessary authorities, his professional conscience deeply offended by the brazen fraud. I want the family trust restored to its original state, as per John's intentions, I stated, my eyes fixed on a patch of sunbeam dancing on my worn floorboards. And I want nothing further to do with Arthur or Penelope, or any of their schemes. Ensure every legal tie, every financial thread, is irrevocably severed. There was no anger in my voice, only a cold, decisive clarity. The idea of their public humiliation, of their polished veneer shattering, was a consequence, not a primary objective. My real prize was the quiet peace of knowing their manipulation could no longer reach me. The ensuing weeks were a whirlwind, though I remained largely sequestered in my cottage. Mr. Davies moved with impressive speed and precision. The legal notices were served. The news, when it broke, was a quiet but devastating tremor through the social circles Arthur and Penelope had so desperately cultivated. The shell corporation was dissolved. The fraudulent lease was invalidated. The full extent of their systematic asset stripping began to appear in financial papers, stark and undeniable. Arthur and Penelope tried to fight, of course. They sent frantic, desperate messages, first trying to apologize, then to threaten, then to beg. But my phone remained silent, my doors closed. There was no room for their false repentance or their empty threats. I had spent a lifetime accommodating, overlooking, and quietly enduring. That chapter of my life was firmly closed. I had finally learned that sometimes, the only way to protect your own cloth was to make a definitive, irrevocable cut, leaving behind the damaged threads to unravel on their own. The air in my cottage felt lighter, cleaner, as if a great weight had been lifted. The hum of my sewing machine resumed its peaceful rhythm, now a celebration of freedom, not just routine. The legal proceedings, once set in motion, had the inevitable force of a well-oiled machine. Mr. Davies, true to his word and his professional integrity, pursued every avenue, ensuring that Arthur and Penelope's fraudulent structures were dismantled and the family trust reinstated to its rightful health. My own involvement, true to my nature, remained largely behind the scenes. I signed documents, answered Mr. Davies's occasional questions, and watched the outside world ripple with the consequences of their unraveling. The legacy quilt, once a symbol of their avarice, now sat folded neatly in my cedar chest, a silent testament to a battle won without a single raised voice from my end. The most profound change, however, was not in the recovered assets or the restored trust, but within myself. The constant, subtle hum of being underestimated, of being quietly dismissed, had faded. It was replaced by a calm clarity, a deep-seated peace that settled over me like a comforting, newly finished quilt. The silence in my cottage, once filled with the ghosts of ignored feelings, now resonated with a genuine tranquility. I had, in essence, stitched myself a new beginning, a pattern defined by my own strength and resilience, not by the approval or disdain of others. Arthur and Penelope, stripped of their ill-gotten gains and their carefully constructed public image, became ghosts in my periphery. They were no longer movers and shakers but figures of quiet disgrace, their names whispered with a mixture of pity and scandal in the very circles they had so desperately courted. The constant stream of frantic calls and desperate pleas eventually ceased. I understood, with a quiet certainty, that their punishment was not merely the loss of wealth or reputation, but the shattering of their self-deception. They had believed themselves untouchable, too clever for an old woman who smelled of lavender and lint. That belief, now broken, was their true undoing. Beatrice, my dear friend from the quilting circle, was the only one I shared the full truth with, long after the dust had settled. Over tea and her perfect shortbread, I laid out the story, document by document. She listened, her usually cheerful face growing solemn, then slowly brightening with a fierce pride. "Eleanor," she said, her voice soft but firm, "you are a force to be reckoned with." They never stood a chance, did they? Her validation, offered simply and genuinely, was like the final, securing knot in a project completed with care. My days resumed their familiar rhythm, but with a new lightness. I still quilted, of course, but now each stitch felt imbued with purpose, a celebration of self-reliance. I started a new quilt, not for anyone else, but for myself. It was a riot of colors and textures, unconventional and bold, reflecting the woman I had become. The old orchard land, now fully restored to the family trust and managed ethically, stood as a testament to John's vision, and to my quiet, unwavering defense of it. My connection to it was no longer a burden of stewardship, but a joyful recognition of a legacy preserved, not through grudging forgiveness, but through resolute, strategic action. I had reclaimed my own cloth, and it felt like the softest, most luxurious silk against my skin. My small cottage, once merely a refuge, now felt like a throne room, though I ruled over nothing more than threads and fabric. The battles had been fought not with shouts and accusations, but with meticulous research and quiet strategy, a slow unraveling of deceit that had now settled into a profound peace. John's legacy, once threatened, was secure. My own future, once shadowed by the manipulative hands of Arthur and Penelope, was entirely my own to pattern. The world outside my windows still spun, of course. Arthur and Penelope, I heard through Mr. Davies's brief, professional updates, had retreated from their former prominence. Their diversified investments had proven to be a tangled mess once the fraudulent structures were exposed, and their once pristine social standing had frayed into whispered scandal. They were like a once vibrant tapestry, bleached by the sun, their intricate design now faded and unremarkable. I felt no triumph in their downfall, no lingering anger, only the quiet satisfaction of seeing balance restored, a ledger set right. Their punishment, I believed, was to live with the truth of what they were, stripped of the illusions they had so carefully spun around themselves. My victory wasn't about their suffering, it was about my freedom. The greatest change wasn't in the external world, but in the internal landscape of my heart. The ache of being overlooked, of having my quiet intelligence mistaken for senility, had evaporated. It was replaced by a bedrock of self-assurance, a quiet knowing that my intuition and methodical approach had been proven true. I had discovered an inner resilience, a strength I hadn't known was there, buried beneath layers of polite compliance. It was a strength born not of defiance, but of patient observation and strategic action. Beatrice continued to visit, her presence a comforting, steady seam in the new fabric of my life. Our quilting circle still met, but the conversations now felt lighter, untainted by the unspoken anxieties that had once hummed beneath our needles. I had started a new quilt, not a legacy quilt, for a family that hadn't deserved it, but one entirely for myself. It was a vibrant explosion of jewel tones and unexpected patterns, unconventional and bold, a tangible representation of the woman I had become. Each stitch was a conscious act of creation, a testament to choices made not out of duty, but out of a reclaimed sense of self. I often sat by my window, the new quilt taking shape under my hands, and reflected on it all. The journey had been long, laced with the sharp prick of betrayal and the dull ache of dismissal. But through it, I had found my voice, not a loud one, but one that resonated with quiet authority. I had achieved justice, not through the messy path of reconciliation or forgiveness, which I neither sought nor believed was deserved, but through a calm, strategic vindication that liberated me entirely. My quiet life had once felt like a cage, a place where I was confined. Now, it was my expansive, open field, where I could sow whatever seeds I chose, and weave whatever pattern I desired. This was my personal heirloom of strength, woven from courage and clarity, more precious than any material wealth. Eleanor's story, much like her intricate quilts, reminds us that the quietest hands often hold the sharpest needles. It's a testament to the power of a discerning eye and a patient heart, proving that true strength isn't always found in confrontation, but in the methodical unraveling of deceit. Her journey from silent dismissal to profound liberation isn't just a tale of justice served. It's a powerful echo of every underestimated spirit finding its voice. She taught us that sometimes the most loving act for oneself is to make that final, decisive cut, protecting your own fabric from those who seek to tear it. What a beautiful, unconventional masterpiece she wove for herself in the end. If Eleanor's quiet triumph resonated with your own spirit, and you appreciate tales of strategic vindication and hard-won freedom, then please consider supporting Vengeful Echoes. Subscribe, like, and share these stories so we can continue to bring more narratives of the underestimated finding their powerful truth. May your own days be filled with peace, your heart with quiet strength, and may you always find the courage to weave a life that is truly and beautifully your own.